Long before memory felt like counting days, there was a kingdom set between two gentled mountains and a river that never once forgot to sing. The people said their land was blessed, not because the crops were always tall or the winters always mild, but because sorrow never stayed too long in one place. When grief came, neighbors carried it together, like a heavy jar passed from hand to hand until the weight became bearable. Yet in the heart of this kindly kingdom stood a castle of pale stone, where one sorrow had rooted itself so deeply that it refused to move. It lived on the face of their king. He was not a cruel king, nor a harsh one. He did not raise his voice, and he listened more than he spoke. He walked through his gardens at dawn and read by lamplight at night. He gave away more gold than he kept and greeted his servants by name. And still, in all the years he had worn the crown, no one had seen him smile. At first, when he was young and newly crowned, people waited for joy as if it were a season that might arrive late but would surely come. They told themselves that he was serious because the kingdom needed steady hands, that laughter would bloom when the world was less demanding. But the years passed, and though his hair grew threads of silver and his shoulders carried the easy weight of long habit, his mouth never once curved upward. Children, with their unguarded honesty, sometimes asked their parents, "Does the king know how?" And the parents, who had wondered the same, would hush them gently and say, "Of course. Some people keep their smiles in secret places." One winter morning, when frost traced fragile ferns on every window and the river wore a skin of glass, an old nursemaid shuffled into the kitchen of a cottage near the eastern gate. She warmed her hands by the hearth and spoke without thinking, her voice as familiar as the crackle of burning wood. "They say the king has forgotten what it feels like," she murmured to the bread maker's wife. "To be so long without a smile, surely the muscles of his face must ache with the absence." On the other side of the room, a small boy sat on a low stool, swinging his feet above the packed earth floor. His name was Leo. His hair stuck up as if each strand had its own opinion, and his eyes were the clear brown of river stones. He lived with his grandmother in that cottage, for his parents had been taken by a sickness when he was very young. He did not remember their faces, only the warmth of arms that had once lifted him high. Leo listened to the nursemaid's words and tilted his head. To him, smiling was as natural as breathing, though he did not smile to hide his emptiness or to please others. He smiled when he saw light drip through leaves, when a bird hopped closer than usual, when his grandmother hummed a song she had hummed the day before. The idea that someone could forget how to smile seemed like imagining someone had forgotten how to taste sweetness. "How can a face forget?" he asked aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. His grandmother, who knew that in a kingdom rumors grew on their own and did not need extra watering, patted his shoulder. "Some hearts carry heavy things, little one," she said. "When you carry too much for too long, you hold yourself very still so nothing spills. Sometimes smiling can feel like letting go of something you are afraid to drop." Leo thought about that by the fire until the frost on the window had melted away. He thought as he fetched water, as he helped his grandmother fold linens, as he watched his neighbors set out their small winter offerings of grain for the birds. If the king's heart was heavy, it seemed strange to leave him to carry it alone. "Grandmother," he said finally, wiping his hands on his tunic, "who helps the king with his heavy heart?" She paused, a length of cloth sagging between her hands. "He has advisors and servants and guards. Many stand close to him." "That is not the same," Leo said softly. "I mean who holds it with him." His grandmother, who had known both crowded rooms and empty beds, understood the difference. She threaded her needle with care before she answered. "Perhaps no one," she admitted. "Some people think kings need no such help. They forget that crowns do not make hearts lighter." Leo walked to the door and looked out at the village street. Smoke curled from chimneys. A stray dog nosed at a crust of bread. A flock of birds lifted as one from a bare tree. The world was full of small, ordinary miracles, Yet somewhere near the center of all this quiet life, a man sat alone with a heart too heavy to let his mouth bend to joy. He felt a small, steady tug inside, part curiosity, part concern. It was like seeing someone trying to lift a load that was clearly too much and knowing that his own hands were empty. "Has anyone asked him?" Leo said. "Has anyone said, 'Majesty, may I help you remember?'" His grandmother gave him a long look. There was something in his voice, a simple sincerity that made it hard to answer with the usual adult evasions. "No one I know of," she said at last. "Then perhaps I should," Leo replied. It might have been an ordinary child's boast, the kind that floats away like smoke. But Leo's words settled into the room with the quiet weight of intention. His grandmother set down her sewing and folded her weathered hands. "The castle is far, and they do not simply open the gate for anyone," she warned gently. "They might open it for someone who is not asking for gold," Leo said, "only to share a smile." His grandmother smiled then, a little sadly. "You cannot give what someone will not take." "I know," Leo said, "but I can hold it out." She saw something of his father in the tilt of his chin, and something of his mother in the softness of his gaze. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both reluctance and permission. "If you go," she said, "go with polite words and an honest heart. If they turn you away, come back to me, and we will find some other kindness to do in this world." The next morning, before the sun had fully warmed the roofs, Leo put on his thickest cloak and his stoutest shoes. He tucked a small piece of sweet bread into his pocket, not as a gift for a king, but as a comfort for the journey. His grandmother pressed his hands, not too tightly. "Remember," she said, "a crown is only metal, a person sits under it." Leo walked out of the village, past fields sleeping under thin blankets of snow, past the old oak where children tied ribbons in summer. The castle grew slowly larger, its towers like fingers reaching up to touch the pale sky. He did not hurry. Along the way, he greeted an old woman balancing a basket of kindling, a shepherd leading his slow-moving flock, a child even younger than he who had dropped a mitten in the frost. He picked it up and placed it back into the small, surprised hand. Each small exchange seemed to loosen some invisible knot inside him. By the time he stood before the castle gate, his nervousness had settled into a quiet, steady courage. The gate was tall and iron-bound, guarded by two men whose armor had seen better polishing. They straightened when they saw him, more out of habit than alarm. "What business have you, little one?" asked the guard on the left, whose eyebrows were so thick they almost met. Leo looked up without flinching. "I have come to speak with the king." The guard on the right blinked slowly. "Have you?" he said, not unkindly. "And about what grand matter?" Leo hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he knew how his answer might sound. At last he said simply, "About his smile." The guards exchanged a glance. One might have laughed if the boy's face had held even a hint of mischief, but Leo's expression was grave and clear. "I mean no trouble," Leo added quickly. "If he will not see me, I will go home. But if no one asks him, how will he ever remember?" The guard with the meeting eyebrows scratched his chin. There was something disarming in the child's straightforwardness, as if he had brought not a demand but a question that had been waiting in many hearts. "Wait here," the guard said after a moment. "No promises." He disappeared through a smaller door set into the larger gate, leaving Leo alone with the sound of his own breathing and the distant caws of crows on the castle walls. He felt the cold creep through his shoes and into his toes, but he did not stamp his feet or pace. He stood as still as he could, as if practicing the patience he might need. After what felt like both a long time and no time at all, the smaller door opened again. The guard emerged, accompanied by a woman in a plain but well-made gown. Her hair was braided and coiled neatly, and her eyes were shrewd yet gentle. "I am Mara, attendant to His Majesty," she said. "You wish to speak to the king about his smile." Leo nodded. She studied him, not in the way people sometimes study curiosities, but as if she were weighing his sincerity against the burden of bringing yet another small, perhaps foolish hope to the one man in the kingdom who had forgotten laughter. "Come then," she said at last. "If nothing else, you may warm yourself by the fire." Inside, the castle smelled faintly of beeswax and old stone. Leo watched his breath cloud in the high, cool corridors as they walked. Mara did not speak, and neither did he. There was a quiet between them that felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath. At last, they reached a pair of carved doors. Mara paused, smoothing her palms over her skirt. "The king is in council," she said softly. "His time is not often his own. If he sends you away, you must not take it as unkindness." "I will not," Leo said. Mara pushed the doors open just wide enough to slip through, then gestured for Leo to follow. He entered a long hall warmed by tall fires and lit by winter's pale light filtering through stained glass. At the far end, on a simple throne of polished wood rather than gold, sat the king. He was not as fearsome as Leo had imagined. His crown was a band of hammered metal, heavy enough to leave faint dents in the gray of his hair. His face was strong, but lined at the corners of the mouth and eyes, not with joy's crinkles, but with the wear of long wakefulness. Around him stood advisors and scribes, each holding parchments and seals, their talk hushed to a respectful murmur. When the door closed behind Leo, the murmurs faded. Many eyes turned toward the small figure by the entrance. Mara stepped forward, bowed, and spoke in a tone that carried without effort. "Your Majesty, this child has come from the village by the eastern gate. He asks to speak with you on a matter close to his heart." The king did not sigh or frown. He simply looked at Leo, his gaze steady but not hard. There was fatigue there and a kind of distant curiosity, as one might feel upon discovering a bird had somehow flown into a room long closed. "What is your name?" the king asked. "Leo, Majesty," the boy replied, his voice smaller than it had seemed at the gate, but still clear. "And what matter presses so greatly that you must bring it here yourself?" the king said. Leo swallowed. The hall seemed vast, and his words, once so simple on his tongue, now felt fragile. "I came," he said slowly, "to see if you had forgotten how to smile, and if you had, to help you remember." There was a small ripple among the courtiers, the half-suppressed sound people make when something startles them into nearly laughing, but they are unsure if laughter is allowed. The king's face did not change. "You speak frankly," he said. "Who sent you with this question?" "No one," Leo replied. "I heard the old nurse in our village say that your face must ache with the absence of a smile. It seemed a lonely thought. My grandmother said that some hearts carry heavy things and hold themselves very still. But she also said that crowns do not make hearts lighter. So I came to see if there is any way someone like me could help." The king regarded him for a long moment. In the silence, the crackle of the fire sounded like distant rain. "Many have tried to make me smile in their own ways," the king said at last. "Minstrels with jokes, entertainers with tricks, nobles with gifts, foreign rulers with their polished flattery. They offered what they thought joy should look like." Leo's brows knitted. "Did you ask them too?" "No," the king answered. "Then perhaps they were giving you what they wanted you to want," Leo said, "not what you needed." One of the oldest advisors shifted, a faint, approving gleam in his eye. The king's gaze sharpened, not in anger, but as if something had brushed against the surface of his long-held stillness. "You speak as if you know what I need," he said. "I do not," Leo admitted. "I only know what it feels like when sadness sits too long and stops moving. My grandmother and I light a candle together on the day my parents died. We do not speak much, but we remember that our hearts can hold both sorrow and warmth. The remembering makes it lighter. I thought, perhaps you have had no one to help you remember." The king's hand moved, almost unconsciously, to the arm of his throne, fingers pressing into the carved wood. There was a faint whiteness to the knuckles. "When I was young," he said quietly, "I smiled easily. I laughed at spilled ink and crooked hats and sparrows stealing crumbs from under the tables. Then came years when every message carried bad news, fields flooded, sickness spreading, neighbors at odds. I visited homes heavier with grieving than yours. I sat with mothers who had lost children, with farmers who had lost their land. I thought that if I kept my face still, if I did not let joy touch it, I was honoring their pain. That to smile was to forget them, or to pretend the world was kinder than it had proved." He paused, as if surprised at the length of his own confession. "In time," he continued, softer still, "not smiling stopped being a choice. It became the shape my face grew into, as if the mask had settled and would not lift. The people began to call me the king who never smiled. It made them feel I was steady. But in quiet hours, I wondered if I had not simply forgotten how to be whole." Leo listened without fidgeting, his hands folded before him, small fingers slightly curled. When the king finished, the boy drew a careful breath. "When we light our candle," Leo said, "we do not pretend my parents will come back, but we also do not send away every feeling that is not sadness. If I remember how my father's hands were always warm, sometimes it makes me ache, and sometimes it makes a small warmth in my chest. Both can be true." He looked up into the lined face above the crown. "If you never let yourself feel anything but the weight of their sorrows, Majesty, you carry them alone. Maybe the people you grieve for would not want that. Maybe they would want you to feel warmth too, when there is warmth. Not because nothing hurt, but because something good still can." The hall was so quiet that the whisper of a log collapsing into ash in the hearth drew everyone's attention for a heartbeat. "You speak of sharing burdens," the king said, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Yet a crown, by its nature, separates. Those who love me do so carefully. They wish to spare me." Leo reached into his pocket then, fingers closing around the piece of sweet bread. He had meant it for himself, for courage, but courage now seemed to be something he gave rather than ate. He stepped forward, not running, not bold, but with the intense steadiness of offering something fragile. The guards at the walls shifted, uncertain, but the king held up a hand and they stilled. Leo stopped at the foot of the dais and uncurled his fingers. In his palm rested the simple crust. "This is not much," he said. "It is only the sweeter half of the loaf I had with my grandmother this morning. I saved it to remind myself I was not alone if I got afraid. Now I think perhaps you should have it, so that you remember you are not alone either, even if you feel like you must be." He held it up. There was nothing special about the bread, no enchantment, no perfect shape. Yet the offering traveled through the hall like a warm breath, touching each watching face in some tender, unspoken place. The king looked at the child, at the small, unassuming gift. Something in his chest gave a quiet twist, not sharp enough to be pain, not light enough to be joy, but undeniably movement. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of his crown not as a burden pressing down, but as a ring resting upon him, held there by custom and by the unseen hopes of thousands. He stood. The advisors drew back a fraction, startled at this unannounced break in his stillness. Slowly, he descended the steps of the dais. His boots were soft on the stone, the sound barely louder than his own measured breath. He stopped before Leo, who tipped his head back to see his face more clearly. Up close, the king could see faint freckles on the boy's nose, the way his hair refused to lie flat. He could also see that Leo's eyes were not purely untroubled. There were small threads of his own grief there, woven in among curiosity and care. "Your Majesty," Leo whispered, remembering to bow his head then, the bread still held up between them. The king looked from the bread to the boy, and then past him to the assembled court, to the windows where winter light spilled in, painting the floor with colors from old glass. He thought of all the years he had insisted on carrying grief like a solitary stone, as if doing so were an act of devotion. He thought of all the smiles he had swallowed, fearing they would offend the dead. Very gently, he reached up with both hands. The hall murmured, then hushed as he lifted the crown from his head. The air on his brow was cool. The weight that had been there for so long left a pale circle on his skin. Without the circlet of metal, he seemed, for a moment, more man than monarch, still tall, still composed, but suddenly fallible in a way that made him more real. He knelt, so that his eyes were level with Leo's. "You brought your courage to share," he said softly. "Perhaps it is time I shared something too." He turned the crown in his hands, watching the way the light slipped over the metal, catching in tiny nicks and imperfections he had never really noticed. Then, carefully, he held it out. "Will you touch it, Leo?" he asked. "Not as a subject, but as someone reminding me I am only human. Let your hand rest upon it as you would on the shoulder of a friend." A small gasp rippled through the hall. To invite a common child to lay hands on the crown was unheard of. Yet something in the king's voice stilled any protest. Leo blinked, his throat suddenly dry. It had not occurred to him that his visit would lead to this, that he would be asked to touch the very symbol that set this man apart from all others. But he heard, beneath the request, not a command but a plea so subtle it might have been missed by less attentive ears. To place his hand on the crown meant, in a quiet way, to accept that the king was offering some of his loneliness to be shared. Leo took a breath and nodded. He set the bread down carefully on the nearest step of the dais, then reached toward the circlet. His fingers trembled a little as they came to rest on the cool metal. The crown was heavier than it looked. He could feel the faint ridges and worn places where the king's hands had held it before. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. The hall remained silent, the winter light unchanged, the fire steady. Then something shifted, not on the outside, but inside two hearts linked by that simple, quiet contact. In the king, the long-held belief that he must always remain apart loosened its roots just enough to let another thought breathe. That perhaps accepting comfort was not a betrayal of the suffering he had witnessed. That allowing warmth back into his life did not mean he had turned his back on those whose lives had been cut short or crushed. In Leo, there was an answering awareness of how deeply this man had walled himself away for the sake of his people, how his refusal of joy had been an earnest, if misguided, act of solidarity. The boy understood then, in a way no one had ever quite explained to him, that grown hearts sometimes bind themselves in patterns that seem noble, but that over time become prisons. They stood thus for a long moment, a child, a king, and between them the symbol of all that separated them. The king felt a warmth rising from somewhere long forgotten, not sudden or overwhelming, but like the slow thaw of frost from a field. He lifted his gaze until it met Leo's. "Thank you," he said simply. And then, quite without forcing it, his mouth moved. It was not a broad grin, not a burst of laughter. It was the smallest, softest, most tentative of smiles. Yet it traveled across his face like the first ray of sun across a winter hillside, subtle but undeniable. The lines of wear around his eyes softened, and for the span of a breath, the weight he had carried alone seemed to lighten. Leo's own lips curved in answer, not in triumph, but in shared relief. He felt no magic crackle, no herald of trumpets, no thunder. There was only the warmth of seeing another human being let down a heavy guard. Around them, the court stood very still. Many had served the king for decades and had never seen such an expression on his face. Mara's hand flew to her mouth, not to hide a gasp, but to hold in the sudden ache of her own emotion. The old advisor wiped his eye discreetly, as if dust had found its way there. The king straightened slowly and set the crown aside on a low table. He did not put it back on. Instead, he picked up the small piece of sweet bread from the step and broke it in half. "One for you," he said, handing a piece to Leo. "And one for me. Let us remember that for this moment, my rank matters less than our shared hunger." They ate the bread together. It was slightly stale and too dry, yet somehow, in the sharing, it tasted better than any feast the hall had ever seen. "Will you stay a while?" the king asked then, his voice lighter by a shade. "Tell me about your village, about the candle you light, about your grandmother who knows the difference between being near someone and helping them carry what they hold inside." Leo nodded, settling himself on the lowest step of the dais without waiting for permission that, in that moment, he no longer felt he needed. The king sat beside him, not on his throne but on the same step, so close their shoulders almost touched. They spoke quietly, like two people by a fire at the end of a long day, about simple things, small losses, modest joys. The hall listened in reverent silence, then gently began to breathe again. Advisors shifted their weight, guards leaned on their spears with a new, less rigid ease. People remembered that they, too, could soften without shattering. Word traveled slowly and then swiftly through the castle and down into the town. The king had smiled. Not during a performance, not in response to a clever jest, but in answer to the honest concern of a child who had nothing to gain. Some dismissed it at first as exaggeration, but those who had seen it needed no embellishment. They spoke of a curve of the mouth that carried not giddy delight, but a humble acceptance of shared humanity. In the evenings that followed, the king did not suddenly turn merry, nor did his burdens vanish. There were still disputes to settle, losses to mourn, decisions that weighed heavily. Yet now and then, when a child stumbled in a too long cloak during a ceremony, or when Mara's usually smooth hair came loose in a single rebellious curl, the king's lips would soften at the corners. He allowed himself these small, private smiles. They did not erase the sorrows of his people, but they sat alongside them, proof that the heart could be wide enough for both. Leo returned to his village after spending a day and a night at the castle. When he stepped back into his grandmother's cottage, smelling of stone and smoke and a hint of beeswax, she rose from her chair with tears already bright in her eyes. "Well," she asked, though she could see much of the answer in his face. "He remembered," Leo said simply. "Not all at once, but a little. We touched his crown together, and it was like saying that he did not have to carry the world by himself." His grandmother pulled him close, holding him with both pride and relief. "Sometimes," she murmured into his hair, "the bravest thing anyone can do is show another how to be less alone." That winter, more candles than usual were lit in the windows of the kingdom. Some were for the departed, as they had always been. Some were for hopes, as they had always been. But some, new and quietly insistent, were for the living, for kings and children and grandmothers and neighbors, all trying to remember that grief and joy were not enemies, but companions walking the same road. The king continued to rule with care and seriousness. He did not become a jester, nor did he forget the faces of those who had suffered. But every so often, in the midst of receiving petitions or listening to the quiet hum of the river from his open window, he would recall the feel of a small hand resting trustingly on his crown and the taste of simple bread shared on a cold day. In those moments, the corner of his mouth would lift, almost in surprise, as if his own heart had nudged him from within, saying, "Do you see? We can hold this too." The people, seeing this gentle change, found their own burdens a little lighter. For they understood now that their sorrow did not need to be mirrored exactly on their ruler's face to be honored. What mattered more was that he had chosen to open his heart again, to let warmth and connection seep into the spaces where only duty had lived for so long. And so, in the stories told to children years later, they did not say merely, "There was once a king who never smiled." They said, "There was once a king who wore his crown so heavily that he forgot he was human beneath it. And there was once a child who reached out, not to claim that crown, but to touch it gently and remind him that all the power in the world is poorer than one honest act of shared kindness. In the end, the true legend was not of the smile itself, fleeting and soft as it was, but of the moment two lives met in quiet courage. The king's sacrifice was subtle yet profound. He gave up the comfort of his unchanging mask. The child's gift was simple yet timeless, the offering of companionship to a lonely heart. Between them, a kingdom learned that even the heaviest crowns sit upon human brows, and that sometimes, all it takes to change the shape of a life is the touch of a small, unafraid hand on cold metal, and the willingness, at last, to let a single, careful smile bloom.